Welcome, everybody, to this morning's event, Russia in Turmoil. I'm very glad to see so many of you here. And I think, at least as a list of participants, I wish I could see you closer in person. My name is Nina Tumarkin, and I am the director of the Russian Area Studies program here at Wellesley and a professor of history in the history department. I've invited to have this, I've arranged to have this wonderful event in conjunction with a course I'm teaching right now, a first-year seminar called Vladimir Putin, Personage, President, Potentate. And also have invited you to join this presentation, which is actually meets during my class time, and my students are here. I want to say that there will be a Q&A after the presentation, and if you're interested, then please use the chat function, and we can get to at least some of your questions that you would write in there. So, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, the Russian president, the authoritarian leader of the world's largest country, with its vast reserves of oil and gas and nuclear warheads, is a major player on the global stage and meddler in chief in US domestic politics. He's led Russia for 20 years and is now in his fourth term as president, which ends in 2024. According to a constitutional change that was voted in last year, he's now allowed to run for 2 more terms until 2036, which would make him very old indeed. In the US, Putin is viewed as almost magically powerful. But in recent months, not only has Russia been hard hit by the pandemic, it has the 4th largest number of cases in the world, but also massive protests met by unprecedented levels of police brutality, unprecedented in the history of Russia, not in the history of the Soviet Union, of course. To shed light on all of this, I am delighted and grateful to introduce our speaker, Maria Lipman, who is in Moscow, where I'm not sure if I can just check. The current temperature is very cold. At the moment, it's 1 degree. So, she is a senior associate for PONARS, which is the Institute for Russian, European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. She produces a PONARS Eurasia podcast. Her fields of interest include state-society relations, media, politics of history and ideas. Maria Lipman also writes a great deal. She writes capsule reviews of books about Russia and Eastern Europe for the renowned journal Foreign Affairs. From 1995 until 2019, she was the editor or deputy editor of various Russian language publications. And for much of that time, she was an associate at the Moscow Carnegie Center, which is the Russian branch of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From 2001 to 2011, she wrote an op-ed column on Russia for the Washington Post. And from 2012 to 2017, she wrote a blog for the New Yorker online. And she has contributed to numerous Russian and US publications. Her most recent book publication is an edited volume called Russian Voices on Post-Crimea Russia, which came out in 2020. And she is regularly featured as a Russia expert on a range of international broadcast media. In recent years, Maria Lipman has also taught college here in the States. She taught at Indiana University and also at Grinnell College in Iowa. So we're absolutely delighted to introduce Maria Lipman. And I think I'd like to try to do it properly with this little sound machine that I have here. So Maria Lipman, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina, for this generous introduction, and thank you all for coming to listen to me. Um, Delighted to speak at Wellesley. It would, of course, be even more delightful if I could do so in person, but we all have to abide by the new rules and regulations. I have to apologize to begin with. I have a hoarse voice, so I cannot speak more loudly if this is not loud enough for you. So maybe turn up your sound. And I will indeed speak about a very turbulent beginning of 2021. Let me first very quickly go over the chain of events that began in mid-January. On January 17, Alexei Navalny, the Kremlin's most prominent domestic opponent, returned to Russia despite repeated warnings from law enforcement that he would be arrested upon return. He was returning from Germany, where he was recovering after being poisoned in Russia by a nerve agent. Navalny indeed was arrested immediately upon arrival. His charge is parole violations. He failed to report to the police while recovering in Germany. And his team promptly posted a YouTube video about the so-called Putin's Palace that collected over tens of millions views within days. Right now, the number of views has reached 113 million. The film worked to desacralize Putin. Social networks filled with memes, political jokes, songs, and video clips making fun of Putin and his alleged palace. The Kremlin was silent for over a week. When it finally responded to the allegations made in the film, the response looked laughable, at least to those who shared anti-Putin sentiment. The Kremlin's lame response emboldened the social network users even further, and Navalny's arrest and the film triggered mass street protests across Russia. The protest rallies were staged first on January 23rd. Their geography was even more striking than the actual numbers of those who took to the streets. The number of cities, according to various estimates, the cities where protest rallies were staged ranged between 100 and 200, and the number of participants was estimated to be at least 160,000 people. Identical chants were heard across Russia, the most common among them being "Putin is a thief" or "Free Navalny." Almost 4,000 people were detained by the police on that day. More protest rallies followed on January 31st. Those brought together fewer people, but the actual number was very hard to estimate, especially in Moscow, because the city center was cordoned off by the police, and crowds scattered. People were running back and forth. It was really hard to tell how many of them were in the streets. The police, as Nina already mentioned, acted with unprecedented brutality, far more brutally than on January 23rd. For the first time, the police used electric shockers and tear gas, not across the board though, but there were episodes in which both these tools were used. Detention centers quickly grew overcrowded. Let me show you a few scenes from the city streets on January 31st. So just to give you an idea, as you can see, people are totally peaceful, and the police certainly is not. On February 2nd, hearings of Navalny case were held in Moscow. As expected, he was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in jail for parole violations. His original term of 3.5 years was actually, it was reduced to the 10 months that he served under house arrest. The police wouldn't let Navalny's supporters anywhere close to the courthouse, and many more people were detained. The overall number of detainees on January 23rd and 31st and February 2nd reached an unprecedented number of over 11,000 people. In the rest of my presentation, I will say a few words about Alexei Navalny himself, and I will then talk about what is new about the current protests and about their political and social implications. I will also describe what detention implies, what it is that the detainees go through when they are detained, and I will talk about the civic organizations and volunteers that deliver assistance to the detainees. Now, Navalny is 44 years old. He's a lawyer by education. He has long engaged in various public and political activities and earned popularity first and foremost as an indefatigable anti-corruption crusader. For many years now, he has produced videos. The one about Putin's palace was the last, with allegations of wrongdoings of the highest ranking officials. Those videos have grown highly popular thanks to Navalny's ability to explain complicated schemes in a simple way and in a funny way, which is also important, to generate memes that become viral, and of course, thanks to high quality video production. Navalny was also able to build trust. People eagerly donated to his anti-corruption cause, which was a unique achievement back 10 years ago and more, since at that early time, crowdfunding was mostly limited to charitable activities, such as assistance to children with in need of expensive medical treatment. Navalny grew even more prominent in 2011 and 12 during an upsurge of mass protests against election fraud at the 2011 parliamentary election in Russia. He gave fiery speeches and was always at the center of an admiring crowd. So here's Navalny of those years. Navalny is a natural-born public politician in a country, Russia, where public politics and genuine political competition have been all but outlawed, especially at the federal level. Navalny has an excellent capacity to work a crowd. He's a great public speaker. He's unbending, fearless, and also handsome and funny. He has a beautiful wife who stands firmly by his side and 2 children. So here's Navalny in court very recently, February 20th this year. And just one second. Here's Navalny with his wife during his rehabilitation in Germany. After the protest wave of 2011 and 12, the Kremlin came to regard Navalny as an unwelcome troublemaker. And up until recently, members of the establishment never mentioned Navalny by name. Putin still doesn't. They pretended that he's just so unimportant, he can be dismissed and not called by his own name. They referred to him as a blogger or that man, and after his poisoning as the Berlin patient. But while the establishment pretended that Navalny was unimportant, that man was repeatedly harassed, physically attacked, persecuted, and prosecuted. He spent many days under arrest and house arrest, but never for a long time, usually days, sometimes weeks, but not long months or years. In 2013, he was even allowed to run for Moscow mayor and gained 26% of the vote, came in second after the incumbent. Apparently, up until recently, the Kremlin thought Navalny was less of a threat at large than in jail, and less of a threat alive rather than dead. Navalny defied the pressure and the risks, and he worked very hard to broaden his public awareness. After 2013, he was legally barred from running for any office as a result of one of his prosecutions, but he managed to create across Russia a network of the so-called Navalny's headquarters. These are teams of loyal supporters who engaged in the organization of local electoral campaigns. And in September 2020, in 2 or 3 regions, their candidates won seats in local legislatures. In 2020, the Kremlin's tactic toward Navalny dramatically changed. Navalny was poisoned during that particular local series of local campaigns as he was visiting his headquarters in Siberia. We don't have firm proof that Navalny was poisoned on the Kremlin's orders, but such suspicions are rather strong. His poisoning was likely intended to kill him, but he survived, and now he is behind bars for at least over 2 years and probably longer. Now, why has the Kremlin changed its policy toward Navalny? Several reasons or factors can be mentioned. In September this year, Russia will have a parliamentary election. The Kremlin needs public support to ensure a strong pro-Kremlin majority in the legislature. And meanwhile, the current public mood makes this goal not so easy to achieve. The broadly shared discontent is associated with the COVID pandemic, not so much the pandemic itself, but its economic consequences. Now, here are a few words about the economy. So the economic decline, stagnation, as it is described by the economists, has gone on for almost 10 years now. And according to the official data, in 2020, people's incomes have declined by 3.5% compared to 2013. The real disposable incomes have dropped by over 10%. The number of Russians who live below poverty line has grown by 400,000. Today, they amount to almost 20 million people, or 13% of the population. Elections to the Moscow legislature, this is Moscow City Assembly, back in 2019 led to mass protests against the unfair game that was used against undesired candidates. In this context, Navalny's headquarters in the regions were likely seen as a serious threat. The Kremlin changed its policy, not just toward Navalny, but also towards street protests. As I mentioned, the police brutality was unprecedented. Protest rallies are not uncommon in Russia. Most of them are local and socioeconomic in nature. Such protests are often provoked by intrusions on a territory that people think of as their own, most often by unwelcome construction projects of luxury housing development, sometimes churches, sometimes waste treatment plants or just landfills. But even political rallies have been quite a few. I will now show you the protest of 2011 and 12, which, as I mentioned, is the moment when doesn't work for me anymore for some reason. Oh, right. Yes. Yes, so this impressive photo shows the protest in Moscow in December 2011 that I already mentioned. It was a protest rally, mostly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Russia's two largest cities, and it was against a protest against the election fraud in a parliamentary election of December 2011. I will very quickly mention a few more political protests that were staged since then, just to give you an idea. There was a political rally in support of those who were prosecuted in connection with the rally of 2011 that also continued into 2012. Also in response to the assassination of a prominent Kremlin opponent, Boris Nemtsov. There was also a political rally against the war in Donbass that followed the annexation of Crimea, against the legal ban on foreign adoption of Russian orphans. Most recently, as I already mentioned, we had major protests in Moscow in the summer of 2019 against the election fraud during the elections to the Moscow City Assembly. And this list, of course, is not complete. So I mentioned some of the new challenges faced by the Kremlin in the lead up to the September Duma elections. And here are a couple more factors that make the situation different and maybe more challenging to the Kremlin. One factor is the delayed discontent over the constitutional reform introduced by Putin in 2020. Nina mentioned it in her introduction. The key change that was introduced was the so-called zeroing amendment that enabled Putin to remain president basically for life. Well, technically until 2036, but it is interpreted as a lifetime presidency. The Kremlin organized a popular vote on the constitutional amendments in summer amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Polls taken prior to this vote showed that the number of those who approved and who disapproved of the constitutional changes, and first and foremost, this applies to the zeroing amendment, that those numbers were actually almost the same. 48% approved, 47% disapproved. But those who disapproved often chose not to come to the polls. The Kremlin promptly announced a resounding victory for Putin, which certainly caused strong disaffection among those who disliked the very idea of constitutional amendments and the zeroing. And their disaffection further deepened since the vote was accompanied by manipulations and fraud. However, amidst the pandemic, this disaffection did not trigger street protests. One more factor that should be noted is the growing rift among between younger Russians and older Russians. Not so much the parents' generation, rather the grandparents' generation. The dividing line runs between TV viewers who still constitute the power base of Putin's regime and the internet and social network users. Young ones in Russia increasingly tend to have a different mindset, different values, different interests, use a different language. Of course, it's still the Russian language, but theirs is quite different. And recently, they also share political perceptions that are different, increasingly different from their grandparents. They tend to feel more negative toward Putin and Russia's general track. And of course, the young of today are even more tech savvy than 10 years back. Since then, YouTube and Instagram have become ubiquitous. Live streaming has become easily accessible, and at least a dozen resources streamed the January protests, just to give you an idea. These new internet resources are not just a source of information, they also facilitate new social practices, participation, support, cooperation, but of course, they also make such practices more transparent to law enforcement. To those who are in their late teens or early 20s today, Putin certainly looks like a grandfather. And he's not capable of playing the role of a good old grandpa. To the young, and especially those who took part in the protests and their sympathizers, he's more like a mean old grandfather. Or as Navalny put it, and Navalny is great at generating memes, Putin looks like Gramps in the bunker. Navalny spoke about him this way because of Putin's long-time isolation during the COVID pandemic. For Putin, this growing rift means that he has lost his image of a uniter that he had enjoyed for a few years after the annexation of Crimea. One more factor that contributed to the Kremlin's hardened policy is the public uprising in neighboring Belarus that lasted for several months since the summer of 2020. Now, to summarize, the factors that raised the Kremlin concerns, especially prior to the September Duma elections, something that I have already spoke about, but just to summarize. So the general public discontent, the COVID-19 and the economic decline related to it, elections to the Moscow legislature back in 2019 that led to mass protests, the growing rift among young Russians and older Russians, and the public uprising in the neighboring Belarus. So this accounts for a changed atmosphere And this likely explains both the changed policy toward Navalny and the changed treatment, the hardened or much harsher treatment of those who took part in the protests. Now, as I mentioned, police brutality reached unprecedented scope. And I will now explain what detention means and how the detention procedure looks. So you're grabbed by the police, maybe by one policeman or several. If you're an activist they are already looking for, they will ask you to show your ID to make sure that this is indeed you. If you're not an activist, just somebody who joined the rally or just happened to be passing by, they just grab you. You may ask why, what have I done? But the police will not explain anything. They will just tell you that you'll be told when you are delivered to the police station. The police will not identify themselves. They have to wear badges, and they do wear them, but they commonly wear them so one cannot see them. They throw you in a police van. Scores of police vans are parked around the city streets ahead of any rally. You're left there waiting with others until the van is full. There's police inside the van, and you may ask them, why have I been detained? What did I do? And the response will be, I have not detained you. I don't know, ask those who did. When the van fills up, you are taken to a police station. By the time you get there, it's been hours since you were grabbed. The police station will be your third police stop after those who grabbed you and those who delivered you. There, a policeman will finally identify himself and read you the rules of conduct at the police precinct. He will also hand you a mask if you don't have one. You may ask him, why have I been detained? And he will, of course, say, I have not detained you. Stop 4 in this conveyor line will be a policeman who will hand you a police report. Now, the number 4 policeman, of course, has no idea where, when, or why you were detained. His report's account will have nothing to do with the fact on the ground. He will cite the time when you were delivered to the police station, not the time when you were grabbed. And the scene where your alleged misconduct took place will be randomly picked. Most likely your actions will be described in a standard manner. It will say that you yelled, Putin is a thief, free Navalny, that you got in the way of traffic and violated public order. If you're well prepared and cool-headed, you'll claim that this has nothing to do with the actual circumstances and you will not sign the police report. If you have the guts to insist, you will be allowed to write down your own version of the events. In theory, this might make a difference if you go all the way to higher courts. It is more likely to make a difference if you get all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, but this makes sense if you are really badly mistreated. Your misconduct may be punishable by a fine or an administrative arrest of up to 25 days, most commonly 10 or 15, and this will be up to a judge to decide. You may be allowed to go home until your scheduled court hearings or left at the precinct and taken to the courthouse from there. If you're inexperienced, if you're frightened, if you're tired and hungry, and of course you are after many, many hours, the police at the precinct will take full advantage of it. They will tell you that unless you sign the report, you will be detained for a long time, maybe days. If you ask for a lawyer or make any other demand, they will also tell you that in this case, you'll be kept at the station at least overnight. Most or all of it will be untrue. When you eventually show up in court, either from home or delivered from the police station, the police who grabbed you, the police who delivered you in the van, the police who met you at the police station will not be there. Instead, the police will be represented by a person who knows nothing about all those earlier stages, but will confirm that the police report is true. The police thus remains mostly anonymous throughout this conveyor line, from being grabbed to being tried. This system was launched back in 2011 and 12 after the protests that took place back then, and it was honed to perfection by about 2014. The main criterion for detention during January protests was young age. Very few middle-aged people were detained. Gender did not matter this time. In previous years, young women had been rarely detained, but this time around, women have been quite a few among the detainees. As I mentioned, quite a few young ones who were grabbed happened to be simply passing by. Members of Navalny team were treated separately, all put under house arrest until March, and the charge chosen for them was violation of epidemiological regulations related to COVID quarantine. Because the Moscow detention centers got overcrowded, many of the detainees were delivered to centers for illegal migrants far away from Moscow. Those were almost empty. Illegal migrants, of course, are few because of the quarantine restrictions. The conditions at the centers for illegal migrants were much worse than in the Moscow precinct. No mattresses, no pillows or blankets, no food or water. I'll now cite excerpts from one out of countless firsthand accounts posted on Facebook later on by those who had spent in those detention centers, spent time in those detention centers for migrants. The one I will cite is by a young woman who happens to be the girlfriend of one of Navalny's team members. I will quote excerpts. I served 14 days for a retweet. The original tweet, it was by her boyfriend, said, "Don't be afraid to come out to the streets," and had a video of Navalny attached to it. The court ruled that my retweet makes me an organizer of the rally on January 23. I hoped for a fine, not an incarceration, but was sentenced to 15 days for my retweet, while he, she means her boyfriend, was sentenced to 10 days for the original tweet. I was taken to a police station and left there overnight in a tiny windowless room with the light always on. You have to bang on the door if you need to go to the bathroom. I slept on the mattress and covered myself with my coat. After the court ruling, I was taken to a detention center that was relatively normal and had a radio set. I had good company, all political detainees like myself. There were searches every morning and evening, a 1-hour walk every day, and you're allowed to make a call once a day and take a shower once a week. You are not allowed to have a watch, so you never know what time it is. Food is bad and gives you stomachache. The toilet is a hole in the floor, but there's a door so you can hide yourself from the cameras. On February 6, all the girls who had more than 1 day left of incarceration were packed in police vans and taken to Sakharova. This is the name of one of the detention centers for illegal migrants. There, everything was chaotic and nobody was in charge. The confiscated personal items were piled in heaps on the floor. No lists were made. The young woman was, when she was delivered to that detention center, she was denied the right to call home. She cried and screamed before she was finally allowed to make her call. One push-button phone was given once a day for all the cellmates. She continues, food was much worse than in the Moscow detention centers, delivered through a food hatch. The toilet was a hole in the floor with no door. A camera was looking right at you. So my cellmates and I used a disposable sheet and fixed it to the wall with toothpaste in order to screen the toilet. We knew that friends had brought normal food and water for us, as well as other items that we needed, but one had to wait for a long time to get them. You're not allowed to have hair elastic or hand cream. The cell was very dirty and moldy and unbearably hot. She concludes her post with an expression of gratitude. Words fail me to describe my gratitude to all of you for your help, your support, and your kind words. I value so high what you've done for me. Her gratitude goes to those who joined the large-scale civic assistance operation, which is another highly important aspect of the recent developments. A broad operation of assistance to the detainees has been organized since the first detentions on January 23rd. A user-friendly information base of the detainees has been compiled. Telegram chats were launched for every cell, not for the inmates. Their phones were taken away from them, but for the volunteers or those who were looking for their friends and loved ones. Collections of money, warm clothes, and basic supplies has been organized, as well as the delivery of food and drinking water and many other items. The two detention centers that were originally intended for illegal migrants are located over 100 kilometers away from Moscow. Clear instructions have been put together so volunteers know what they can and cannot do, and so their effort not be wasted. This ad hoc organization complemented the intense effort of established public organizations. I will mention just two of those. In fact, there are more. So one of them is called OVD Info. OVD stands for actually a police precinct. VD stands for Interior Affairs, an Interior Affairs branch. But they, of course, are not the police. They are a civic organization. It was launched after 2011 and 12 mass protests. They are engaged in collecting information about detentions and arrests. And they post this information on their website with an amazing speed. So those looking for their friends and loved ones may find this information. They also work in close cooperation with lawyers and provide legal assistance for those who have been detained. There are always lawyers on duty around the clock in time of mass protests, so the police can rush to the police precincts as soon as there appears information about detentions. In time for mass protests and mass detentions, this organization also draws on numerous volunteers, and at the height of the January protests, the number of such volunteers reached many thousands. Another organization that I would mention is called Media Zone. They usually call themselves in English, Zona Media in Russian, was founded in 2014 by members of the Pussy Riot group. Now, this organization is a web-based outlet that covers everything that has to do with political persecution and prosecution. Its top editor was among the detainees this time, even though he never left home. Several media outlets have republished Media Zone materials as a sign of solidarity with its editor. I will quote Maria Aceman. She's a lawyer and a dogged defender of the victims of political prosecution. This is from her Facebook post something that she wrote after visiting the Center for Migrants, for Illegal Migrants. The civil society, she writes, has been at its best. There's evidence everywhere of volunteers' effort, solidarity, and the joy of being together. She wrote this after she was able to find in the detention center a young man with psychological problems who was detained and separated from his elder brother who took care of him. The brothers are not Muscovites and had no idea that Moscow even had the protests on that day, just happened to be close by. And my last quote will be from a volunteer. She's a young woman, not at all an activist. She just decided to contribute to the assistance campaign. She and a friend, also a young woman, responded to the call for those who have cars and can drive all the way to the detention center. Remember, it is over 100 kilometers away from Moscow, to pick up detainees released after having served their 10 or 15 days. The detainees need to be picked up because the center is in the middle of nowhere. There is no public transportation. And besides, they also were, for some reason, released in the middle of the night. So the following is from a Facebook post of that woman. We drove for about 1.5 or 2 hours. The detention center looked, as expected, grim cubes with barbed wire. There were many cars with other volunteers like us parked near the fence. In one of the cars, they were the organizers who made sure no released detainee be left behind. The organizers had hot tea, food, and phone chargers in their car. The young man, a boy actually, whom we picked, was very young. He was a mathematician. He told us that he loved chess, and he said that he and his cellmates made checkers of bread. He was not a Muscovite. His mother could not come to Moscow from her city and was terribly worried during the 2 weeks when he was incarcerated at the detention center. In my view, the importance of autonomous civic initiatives, the drive and ability to organize, and the capacity to achieve the set goals cannot be overestimated in Russia, where all forms of autonomous social organizations were strictly banned throughout the Soviet period. Over the past decade, the rise of civic initiatives of various kinds has been fairly impressive. However, there's been little, if any, progress as far as political organization is concerned. Police brutalities can provoke broader mobilization that in its turn can lead to radical political change. This was the case in Ukraine in 2013, when a rally of mostly young people in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, was brutally suppressed by the police. This provoked mass protests of gigantic scope and eventually led to the Maidan revolution, the escape of the then president, and a new government in Kyiv. A similar drive was at work in Belarus in recent months, even though it did not result in a revolutionary change. The outrage over police brutality has been a mobilizing force in Russia as well, but its main manifestations were the organization of assistance to detainees that I just described, the collection of funds to pay the lawyers and to pay the fines levied on the detainees, most of whom cannot pay those fines, cannot afford to pay them, and collective letter signing by artists, writers, academics, etc., protesting against the brutal treatment of the detainees. In Russia, the anger and desperation do not lead, at least have not led so far, to a broadening of the protest sentiment. The angry emotion is generally still reduced to the same constituency of the young, the users of social networks or Telegram channels. Despite some distinctions of the current protest, so far it looks as yet another wave that has already ebbed, like those before it. Each time after such an upsurge, people go back home, leaving no organizational structure behind them, not a party or a movement they would identify with. The word opposition that journalists commonly apply to describe this constituency is misleading. Rather, they are a coalition of the fed-ups, as one observer described it. I think this is a very apt description. There is no opposition in Russia as a force that shares the political goal. Of course, Putin is a thief is not a goal. This is not a force that seeks political engagement. Neither does this constituency have a political leader. Navalny is Russia's main oppositionist who managed, despite insurmountable obstacles, to become a figure of nationwide and recently even global scope. But for all his political talents, his fearlessness, his personal charisma, Navalny failed to become a broadly recognized alternative leader for Russia. Not in the protest environment or among the broader constituency of critically minded Russians, and certainly not among broad public. The protesters and those who sympathize with them are much more likely to share anti-Putin sentiments than support for Navalny. In January, Navalny has generated a massive chain of events that I've been talking about. As commentators said, he stole the Kremlin agenda, forcing the establishment to respond to the events related to himself, rather than pursue their own earlier made plans. Even Putin's annual State of the Nation address has been postponed. But this chain of events failed to raise Navalny's approval rating. It was 20% in November last year and 19% in January this year. Overall, the majority of the Russian people did not support the January protests. So I will show you the results of a recent poll. So this shows the attitude to the participants of the protest rallies. And you see, I hope you see the numbers. To the left are the ages, which shows how different these perceptions are, from 18 to 24, the top line, to 55 plus, the one before last line, and the average. The last line shows the average. So 22% on the average approve or take a positive attitude to the participants of the protests. 37% take a neutral or indifferent attitude to it, and then 39 tend to feel negative about it. As you can see, these numbers are very different among the young. However, this is not an overwhelming support, very far from it. So the majority appears to stick to a habitual sentiment. They tend to prefer status quo to change, since change is seen as more likely to make things worse, not better. Those troublemakers who call for change may count on only a limited support, at least for the time being. The state, in the meantime, has gone over to a propaganda offensive against Navalny. The Kremlin used to ignore him, and Putin still does, as I said, never mentioned him by name. But currently, state-run TV channels have unleashed a smearing campaign against Navalny. Of course, Navalny's supporters are unaffected by this propaganda, and they don't watch television anyway. But this coverage and this propaganda continues to shape the mindset of the Kremlin power base and of some among the indifferent ones. The state gets more repressive and brutal, though still not as bad as in the neighboring Belarus, and may be expected to grow even more intolerant in Russia towards civic activism as well. So far, the government has tolerated the assistance campaign. This is not the case in Belarus. The Kremlin relies on its super powerful law enforcement and the propaganda machine. It has concentrated in its hands gigantic economic resources. It has accumulated substantial cash reserves. However, the zeroing of Putin's presidential terms and his virtually lifetime presidency have failed to put an end to political uncertainty. The public discontent will not go away, and civic activism will not be fully squelched. Putin himself will not get any younger and has no chance of re-emerging as his nation's uniter. This means that he cannot guarantee his regime's stability and legitimacy to the extent that he did before. Younger generations in Russia will naturally live to see not only the physical end of Putin, they naturally will. But even before that happens, they may live to see him become a liability to his system, not an asset. Thank you.
All right, start video. Yes. Well, thank you very much. That was really such an informative and new approach, especially talking about um, all of that's going on in terms of the detention centers and those volunteers for the detainees that has not been written up in the media in terms of the volunteers. So it's absolutely fascinating. And I would like to now turn to questions. I'm going to specifically ask the students in my class to post questions in the chat if they are able to do so. And we'll start with a couple of questions that people have posted already. So Helen Frankly asks, does the interest of the West in Navalny keep Putin from being even harsher vis-a-vis Navalny and his supporters?
That's a difficult question. I'm inclined to say no, but since Navalny has become a figure of not just national but also global scope, his sympathizers hope that this is the case, that this new status will protect him against something still more horrible to happen to him. And already, as I'm sure you read, and as I mentioned in my talk, he already survived so many different attacks and harassment and prosecution and repressions and a poisoning potentially lethal. And we don't know whether the intention was indeed to kill him. And he's now behind bars. Is he safer now that he is a man of international renown? Well, let me join his sympathizers and say that I hope so. But of course, he's now totally at the mercy of the government. He is in jail. Right now, he is in Moscow, but he will soon be transported to a prison camp, hopefully not too far from Moscow. Rumors had it that it will be in the European part of Moscow, not too far, not in Siberia. We will soon learn where exactly he will be transported. But unfortunately, I don't have an answer to your question. I hope he is safer now. I hope at least he is not, his life is not in danger, but there is no guarantee.
Very worrisome indeed. Thank you. And apropos danger, Beth Goss asks, thank you, Dr. Lipman. Are you in danger of being detained yourself?
Well, thank you for the question. Actually, I joined the rally on January 23rd, not on January 31st, when the police was especially brutal. Well, as a person of a certain age, I don't think I'm exposed to such danger. As I mentioned, this time around especially, the police targeted younger ones and very young ones. Most of those detained were people in their late teens, early 20s. Most of them were men, even though, as I mentioned, more young women were detained this time than on any of the previous occasions. But as a middle-aged woman, and of course, I was not in the center of it. I spent about, I think, maybe an hour and a half in Pushkin Square. Those of you who've been in Moscow know that this is one of the central squares. Walked around to look at the crowds, to met some friends, went back home. I haven't seen the brutalities. They started later on January 23rd. Over the first hour, 2 hours, the police was actually acting in a rather soft manner, kept warning. There were loudspeakers warning. They were repeating it nonstop. Your action is unlawful. Please leave. They sounded as if they were indeed concerned about the people in the square. But later on in the day, as I mentioned, 4,000 people were detained across Russia, and most of them in Moscow, even on January 23rd.
Thank you. So we have some questions now from students in my class, which I'm delighted. And Miriam Roberts asks, which I suppose you guys can see if you look at the chat yourselves, in a Palace for
Mhm.
Putin video, which, by the way, was part of the assignment for today's class, which will continue after this event is over. Navalny suggests that by taking to the streets, the Russian people will be able to protect democracy. Is he too optimistic? Will grassroots efforts really be enough to prevent fraudulent elections?
Well, this is an excellent question. And of course, the answer is no. Grassroots efforts will not be enough to prevent fraudulent elections and to prevent the Russian authoritarian government um, from taking the decisions that they need. As in conclusion to my talk, I mentioned that they still rely on their super powerful law enforcement and including the police. They have the propaganda machine, they have financial resources, so they are really, really powerful. And of course, grassroots rallies cannot do much against this government. Talking about Navalny, well, Navalny has to believe in his future. Otherwise, what else would inspire him to be so fearless and to be so indomitable and so dogged? Leaders like that have to believe that they will succeed. And this was one reason why, or maybe the main reason why Navalny chose to come back to Russia, even though he knew that he would be arrested as soon as he set foot in the airport. But he is a believer. He is inspired by his vision of a different Russia. He tries to inspire his fellow countrymen, but so far their numbers are certainly not enough. I would also add to this that even in those countries where the grassroots movement and protest rallies are more bring together larger crowds than in Russia, these events do not necessarily lead to a change of government. Look at Venezuela, for instance. A very good example of Hong Kong, where people rallied for weeks and months on end, huge numbers proportionate to the population of Hong Kong, and the situation has not improved. These days, we see, unfortunately, the same in Belarus. So not enough in those countries, certainly not enough in Russia, but this is not a kind of mindset that Navalny has.
Yes, right. So thank you. Leadovai Floresbush asks, you mentioned that for the constitutional referendum, that before the vote happened, the approve and disapprove percentages were similar, but that people who disapproved voted less. What factors contributed to this?
Yeah, this is a very good question that has to do with the general mindset. I think those people who disapproved and said so in the polls, who disapproved of the amendments, and of course, first and foremost, this had to do with the zeroing that enables Putin to run 2 more times for 2 6-year terms. They didn't believe that the outcome of the vote will depend on them. And this is a very important element of the Russian mindset. This time around and on previous occasions, and this is one more reason why there is no political engagement in Russia. Something, again, that I was talking about, that people actually don't think that the politics in the country and policymaking in the country depends on them. This was especially true in the summer of 2020 because of the COVID, because we all know now how the lockdown and this dramatic change of lifestyle drives people even more depressed. And certainly not in the mood to take political action. So that was why they thought that, once again, the government will have it its own way. Once again, they will engage in egregious violations, and they did indeed, but chose not to even be part of it because it was so hopeless.
Right. Yes, thank you. Elizabeth Ray says, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. You mentioned at the end how the young in Russia may live to see Putin become a liability to his system. Could you say a bit more about how and why that might play out? And I should note that students for the first class meeting listen to your podcast, your interview rather, on NPR with Mary Louise Kelly, in which you also ended by talking about Putin perhaps becoming a liability to the Putin system. So how might that
Well,
play
I'm
out?
not exactly sure how, but you know, in Russia, we nominally have all the institutions of democracy, of a democratic polity, two-chamber parliament, of course, judiciary. We have the separation of powers. We have elections. However, at the end of the day, all those institutions of a democratic polity have been emasculated over the years of Putin's rule. And he remains above the whole system as its pillar, as its ultimate decision maker. As the arbiter of the conflicts and conflicted interests among his elites. The system holds on in large part on a notion shared still by most Russians, by a majority of Russians, that there is no alternative to Putin. I cited Navalny's approval rating, so it is around 19-20%. Putin's is over 60. This is a low level for Putin. We remember times when his approval rating was over 80 and near 90. So his rating, his approval rating, this sense that there is no alternative to Putin, is what makes him unique to the system, makes the safeguard of the system's stability and for its for stability for the system and the elites. So if his rating begins to decline significantly, then who is the safeguard? What will keep the system whole? I can suggest pure guesswork, but it can be suggested that not everybody in the establishment is happy with how the things in Russia have turned up during the past years. Growing authoritarian rule and economic decline. However, trying to challenge the system, trying to challenge Putin is suicidal or quixotic or crazy. The risks of doing so are so much higher than the risks of abiding by the rules and remaining loyal, even if things leave much to be desired. So if this one huge pillar, Putin's rating, begins to decline, nobody else except Putin in Russia has an approval rating that is even close to 60+%. But if he's not as popular, if he's not approved to this extent, this undermines his status of the main pillar of his system. This is what I meant. Just how this might happen or when, I wish I knew, but I don't think anybody knows at this point. However, the developments of the beginning of this year and the second half of the previous year, the fact that even ensuring a virtually lifetime presidency for himself has not made the system any more stable, is conducive to a suggestion that time might come when Putin will not be seen as such a safeguard as he is still seen right now.
Yes, thank you. And I think I'll meld together two questions by students about the younger generation. Kaylee Wang asks, would there be any possibility in future for this constitutional reform to be reversed, especially with the younger generation having a negative view on Putin and the Russian government? And Anna Greenthal who also thanks you for the presentation, says that given that the majority of protesters are rather young, do you believe even more youth, more so than other demographics, will be mobilized because of how quickly messages can spread through social media? Or is there a possibility for older demographics to get involved as the movement continues to grow?
Thank you. On the Constitution, well, it is an extremely ungratifying job to try and predict Russia's future. As a political commentator myself, I have to do it, but you can never be sure. The question about what might happen if the system changes, Russia has a new leadership, a new establishment, even this question, I mean, we don't even have an answer to this question. When might this happen? What the new configuration might be? Who the new people might be if they are not Putin or his associates any longer? But the question of what they might do with the constitution is, I'm afraid, too concrete for a country that is as hard to predict as Russia is. In theory, of course, the way the Constitution was amended in 2020 was an egregious violation of, any rules and regulations. There were legal scholars in Russia who said openly that this is a constitutional coup, that this is absolutely unacceptable. Criticism from lawyers, from legal scholars was really, really I don't know, furious. But of course, with the right thing to do is a constitutional assembly. This is a very, changing a constitution, as of course, you know from the experience of your country, is a lengthy process that takes a lot of deliberation by legal scholars, by members of the society and the elites and political class, etc. Just how this might evolve, of course, I cannot say right now, but I hope at least some of the provisions of that constitution would be in some wonderful future will no longer be there, will no longer be on the books. Now, on the young and other demographics, I would not be so carried away even by the young. Of course, the rift is there, and I showed you the results of one poll about what people think about the protests, and you probably saw that even among the young, the support for the protests is not overwhelming. Maybe closer to half, but that's not all. Also, Russia has an aging population. Young people account for a minority. And this will be the case for a while. Demographers can easily predict just how many more people there will be, because there's only there's a certain number of women who will give births, right, at a certain age. And we know which generation, which age cohort will be smaller or larger. So we are now the cohort of those who are in their late teens, very late teens, early 20s is a very small cohort. Whether older people might join them, well, again, this is a very hypothetical question, but I would say that the experience of other countries shows that older people, especially the generation of grandparents, A, tends to be more conservative, naturally so, and B, of course, not as active as to take part in rallies en masse. So they might be supportive, but they are not a force for change. It's up to the young people. At the time of the protest, there were polls taken right in the streets. There's a group in Russia that always takes polls during street rallies. So they counted on January 23rd and January 31st, that about 42% of those who joined the protests were there for the first time. This may be seen as encouraging because more people joined the movement, more people realize that they want things to be changed. However, this is also discouraging because the overall numbers of the protesters was not larger. It was actually smaller than it was back in 2011 and 12. And this raises the question of what those people who used to take part in street rallies, what were they thinking this time and why haven't they joined? So as myself, not a young person, I'm not very optimistic and very upbeat. And this is why I ended my talk with saying that younger people may live to see Putin becoming a liability, and they will certainly see him end his physical existence, but not myself.
Right. Well, speaking of speaking of his physical existence, I think people might like to see this meme that came out during the period of the constitutional reform of showing what Putin might look like as an old man when he's still president. Our time is about up. And I think what I'm going to do is there are two questions left, but I will leave that for our class. And so will Anna Greenthal and Maddie Carrington, will you save your text if I have a difficulty saving it from the chat? And I think we'll wind up and we'll another round of applause for Maria Lipman in Moscow. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing so much about what's been going on in Russia today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, for inviting me. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, and we'll see the students in the classroom in 15 minutes. Thank you.